Welcome to Allegedly Does Not Replicate,
a podcast by the Institute for Replication,
where we put research to the test again.
In this episode, we'll have our first guest talking about self-correcting science.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our new episode of the podcast. We're here today with Jörg Peters to talk a bit about his paper. Is economics self-correcting? I think is going to be a very, very interesting conversation. Jörg, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for having me. So yeah, my name is Jörg Peters I'm from RWI, Leibniz Institute for Economic Research in Essen, Germany. Yeah, so it's great to be here. So I've spent much of my career studying energy and environmental policies, but more recently, well, actually already 10 years ago or so, I've started working also on meta science and replications. And more recently, I've done a lot of work on this, also together with the I4Rs. It's great to be here. It's great to be on board of this whole enterprise. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much for being here. The reason Jörg is here, other than he's a great human being, is he had a very, very interesting paper on whether or not economics as a science is self-correct. And the idea is that looking at the impact of not only comments, but the papers that receive a comment. So I think it's a very, very good topic for our first guest appearance in the podcast. And hopefully we get a very interesting conversation. So Abel, first, hello. And second,
Hey.
What's the first thing that comes to mind when you read this paper?
Yeah, so thanks a lot for being here, Jörg. I'm sure you're going to be a recurring guest for this podcast. So it's great to get things started with you as our first guest. I remember seeing this paper, and actually, I should probably say it just out of transparency, but we put together a special issue at the Economic Inquiry, and the paper was published at Economic Inquiries. We're really happy to have published this paper, but I want to start with the title with you. What do you mean by self-correcting? Or let me put this even differently. Imagine that that someone tells you right now, science is doing really good. People are doing really good research, and there's a lot of new innovation that is being that are developed. There's tons of new patents all the time. Some of the research is done in private sector, some of it public sector. Why would science not correct itself? Why would we want a different type of system? What would you answer to something like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it actually goes deeply into why we did that paper, and probably also are doing a lot of this work. So you're right. Science generally is said to be self-correcting, and I guess it has also kind of demonstrated over history that it apparently is self-correcting, because otherwise it wouldn't be so successful. And I totally agree. And perhaps this goes directly to the question of, is economics and are social sciences actually sciences? Perhaps that could be one answer, right? So or in a way, one might say that economics and other social sciences are perhaps free riding on the term science, because of course the natural sciences have demonstrated, at least in large parts, that they are self-correcting. Otherwise, they wouldn't be so successful. But perhaps that does not apply to the, let's say, more secular sciences. Right. Because, being wrong in the social sciences is perhaps not as bad as being wrong in many natural sciences, let's say, right? Because the stuff that we are doing is I think it's softer, right? We don't build bridges, we don't build airplanes. So if we are wrong, it's perhaps not that bad, and people don't notice as rapidly, at least, as they would in many other, let's say, real sciences.
I think that's a great way of looking at it. When I was a kid and I wanted to be a scientist, right? And the idea of a scientist in my head was this mad scientist mixing stuff in beakers. And then I became an economist, of course. But you could call that a disappointment or not. But the point is, I thought economics as a whole was self-correcting in the same way, let's say, physics was. When you think about, I don't know, let's say one of the greatest physicists ever, Einstein, you think about Einstein correcting the Newtonian way of doing physics, right? And the science advances that way. The problem with economics and social sciences, I think, is that most of what we learn, or the empirical part of what we do, is based on case studies, right? So the problem is that not only we can find different stuff in different places, but it's very difficult to pin down when things work like that and when it's just some isolated case. So how would you say, like, economics should self-correct in a sense?
Again, a very good and deep question. So I think if it's just about case studies, and I'm not saying that I disagree, right? If that's where we are, then perhaps then we are not able to discover or detect general laws. And if we are not able to discover general laws, then it's not a science, perhaps, right? It might still be a very intellectual enterprise, and we might still kind of discuss important things, but we cannot claim that what we are discussing generates or refers to general laws. And to be honest, I think that that's a little bit how I actually see our profession. If that was what we would be doing everywhere, I think I would be happy, right? If that's what we would be doing everywhere, I think we in a place, I guess.
But that's interesting. I mean, so far the conversation is, there's social sciences, there's the hard sciences, and to me, when I think of like comments, when I think of reproduction, replications, I see it the same way in both sciences. I see it as something that is, let's just accelerate things. Like, people think that, when there's someone in physics that comes out with this new theory and just proves something, everybody is just like, yeah, for sure, we agree. And it's like, no, I mean, it's a hard process. People disagree. They fight during seminars, not like literally with their fists, but like there's usually pushback, and it takes time to self-correct things and just to correct, like, just like, things that are not true. It takes a lot of time and efforts. And to me, commons, maybe it's different in the social sciences, maybe it's different in hard sciences, but comments that are published by journals accelerate this by a lot and can actually, instead of you starting your PhD, starting working on something, spending tons of money and time into that endeavor, and at one point you just realize, wow, I'm actually trying to build on some like blocks of knowledge, but actually they're not. They're falsehoods, and I've wasted years of my life trying to do an extension of like a seminal paper, which is garbage. And am I the only one knowing this? Like, no, you talk to other people, and it's like, yeah, I sort of knew that. And to me, this is just like a great way to accelerate knowledge. That's the way I think of comments, and I think of reproductions and replications.
Yeah, no, I think I totally agree. That's what comments ideally do, and often they effectively do this, but it's probably not how the profession handles them, and that's perhaps something we come to in a second, right? So clearly there is knowledge out there also in economics, of course. So our conversations so far should not convey that there is no knowledge in economics. Of course there is, but it's probably much more, the knowledge generation process is much more based on deliberation, or it should be based more on deliberation than on generating scientific facts, right? And that's perhaps the notion that I'm kind of fighting against, right? So some economists claim that we are generating scientific facts, and there I guess we should push back. And comments, and I agree in this sense, comments are the perfect, or one of the important vehicles at least to do this. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, I was asked to refer a paper for, let's say, a general interest journal, and it's in economics, and there's no equation, there's no data, there's nothing. It's just, qualitative and suggesting like a new framework. And I just love it. And I signed my refer report. So if they're listening to this, they will know that it's me. But it's so interesting because they propose like a new framework to think of, like, here's a study. It claims that there's a causal effect between two variables, let's say X and Y, and that they shouldn't. Even though if you use like an RCT or you use any type of like methods, you shouldn't claim just based on one study that this is causal and that this is actually, a direct mechanism that is leading an effect of X to Y. You need many more studies like this, and not necessarily replications, but just like you need generalization of this claim in other contexts. So I guess we're talking about like external validity, but other concepts as well, in order to be able to make that causal claim. And they're basically saying economists should just stop using causal claim for like one study. And to me, like, this conversation is quite interesting, and I really like reading their paper because it sort of goes a bit like with what you're saying right now. But anyway, I guess, let's just get to the article, and are we doing better? Like, if you think of like economics as a discipline, are we publishing more comments?
But better than who? I think that's the question.
Yeah.
Like, because if we're doing better than ourselves 10 years ago, I think Jörg has a very clear answer.
Yeah, I'm not so sure. I know, of course, the stylized facts that you are referring to, and of course we have the I4R now. So in a way, we are definitely doing better today than we were doing before the I4R was there. And we have data and code, and also at least in some parts of our empirical work, pre-specification. But I guess there's still a lot to be worried about, and perhaps the paper we will be discussing in a few seconds still hints us at where some of these worries can be.
But I think it's a great answer. I think, if you look at, the way I was doing research when I started my PhD, like around 2010, you couldn't get anybody's data and codes. Like, it was just not transparent at all. So I think when we look at the behavior of like editors, let's say, their willingness to publish comments might be changing over time, maybe not necessarily in the way that we would want to. But I think if you talk about just like using open science tools, being transparent about your method, being transparent about like, here's the data that I've used, documenting this, I think we've made an insane amount of progress over the past like 10, 15 years, for sure. But are we doing better at the flagship journal of the American Economic Association? Like, what's your take? I mean, to me, like, there's one figure in the paper, and people should check out the paper. There's one figure that is really striking. And I don't think you can interpret this figure as the willingness of editors to publish comment. So just for people who are not watching this on YouTube or listening on Spotify, the paper is called "Is Economics Self-Correcting? Replications in the American Economic Review." And there's one of the figure that is really striking, and it's figure 1 of the paper. And basically what it shows is, I would say the share of articles that are published by the American Economic Review. This is the flagship journal of the main association in economics. And it basically shows a pattern that, there's less comments being published than before. You can go over that and explain this in more detail. But I think, when I look at this figure, I'm always puzzled, like, why do we find that? Why do we find a decline in number of comments? Is it because of demand? Is it because of supply? So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Unfortunately, I can't uncover this one. The supply question is, of course, a great one, right? So how many comments are actually submitted? So how many are rejected? So this, of course, we don't know. And also, to be fair to the journal, it is by far, and that's also why we focus on the journal in that paper. It's the journal that publishes by far the largest number of comments still among the top journals in economics, right? And it's true, the trend is clearly going down. The percentage of both total published papers and empirical papers. Probably also the nature of comments. So if you are watching this on YouTube, you will, or also Spotify, I think nowadays, you will see the graph, and it was really high in the 80s and going down basically to zero almost in the 2000, well, until today actually. I think the nature of comments in the 80s was different. These were also theoretical or conceptual, let's say, comments. So that's certainly something to be taken into account. But nevertheless, even if you account for that, it's still striking to see that at least there is no increasing trend. That's certainly the very conservative interpretation here. And we actually asked the editors, we asked all living editors of the AER for what they think the reasons are. We got some interesting, and also telling responses, but not in the sense of, here's the answer. So they all responded, and they all responded very seriously, and they're interesting. And we have quotes of these responses in the paper. which in itself I think is makes the hopefully worthwhile read. Yeah, so there is no clear answer. The editors themselves, they speculate, but I think to me the takeaway was they don't really know, actually. They don't really know. They didn't even know that there is that trend, which in turn tells me that they perhaps don't really care, which is perhaps a bit unfair. Some of them seem to be really engaged in their response to us. So it seems they do care, but at least let's say they didn't really care actively enough. I think that's a fair, yeah, let's say the AR, even though they relatively care a lot, still doesn't really care much, right, about replications.
Yeah, I think, one thing I would clarify, and I'll do this later, I will just point out that the article is really worth a read. Like, people should read it just because there's actually quotes. So the conversations that you've had with the editors, you can actually read some of their responses in the article. So this is fascinating in itself. I guess, one thing I would push back a bit would be, do they necessarily do not care? And I'll just play, I guess, the devil's advocate, but you could think of this as there's just no comments being submitted. So even if I would deeply care and look, I mean, let's give them like some flowers, like the American Economic Review in economics is the first journal, major journal, let's say, that implemented a data encode availability policy. I think this is back in 2004, like way ahead of the curve. There's other journals like Journal of Applied Econometrics that have been doing this for like way before and are like pioneer. But if you think of like flagship journals, big journals, like clearly some of these editors care about that stuff. They care about like open science. They care about, the process of being able to verify other people's code and so on. The American Economic Review and the American Economic Journals all have a data editor, and we can get into that. So I get, I would push a little bit against like this idea that they don't necessarily care. Maybe they don't. Maybe they do. I don't know. But it's really hard for them to change this trend unless there's like a large number of submissions. Is that fair?
No, it is.
Because I think, in a sense, if editors don't know about the trend, perhaps it could be something else that you point out in your paper, that is that the effect that comments have and the incentives that people have to write a comment should be driving this trend. Like as I'm sure you're going to be telling us in a few seconds, writing a comment doesn't seem to be effective, like in the sense of changing the path of a paper, and in that sense, if it's not going to be effective in driving change in the path of the citations of a paper, is it going to be worth your time to not only invest time in doing this, but also perhaps risking pissing off someone? I wanted to hear your take on this, because as a junior researcher, one of my biggest fears is pissing off someone that is very big. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So in German, there's a saying which also makes a rhyme in German: many enemies, a lot of fame. So in a way, I'm not saying writing comments is about making enemies, but let's say one should be ready to take the risk of making enemies, perhaps, or being perceived like this. Because a lot of this stuff is also projection, right, by peers and people who read or see your stuff, right? And then they have their thoughts, and not all of them tell you, right? And they think stuff like this about you, which is, of course, a little bit weird. So one must not care too much about this kind of stuff, I guess. And one should be ready to, like in the worst case, make enemies. Although, of course, the term is too martial, right? So this is science after all. So it's important, and also an exchange of ideas. So we should be ready to really engage in discussions, even if they appear hostile at the first glance. It's not about, and this is important to emphasize, right? It's never about the individual. It's never about the person that you are, or the person's the person's whatever character and personality. And this is important, and it's often kind of mixed. People melt this or kind of blend this and also project, as I said, on you as the replicator that So many people have asked me, why are you doing this? Are you having personal issues with this person, right? And that's almost an absurd question to me, but it's asked so often that you have to, of course, engage with it, right? So it's a valid question, but I think it's in a way it's misguided, but it's there, so we have to think about it. Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. And to me, the thing I like the most about like, chairing the Institute for Replication is every single like co-director or board members and so on, when you talk to them, they have different views on these things, and I find it fascinating. I mean, my personal take on this is I think original authors often feel targeted, and they feel like there's no comments being published. Like the figure we just showed, how can we put this in perspective for people who are like not economists or not political scientists, or maybe in like, the hard science where there's tons of retractions and matters arising and things like this. Like in the social sciences, the likelihood that you would read a comment being published is so small. It's minuscule. It's like zero. Like in economics as a discipline, of all the journals that we have, hundreds of them, I think every year, according to the Replication Network, there's something like maybe 30 comments being published. So I think if you're an original author and someone actually reproduce or replicate your work, that is a scary thought. It's incredibly scary because it just never happens. And your first reaction is there something wrong with me, with my paper? And what about the other papers? Why did you select mine? Why not any of the other ones? Why are you doing this? And it just leads to me, at least personally, when I see this, tons of problems. Problems for the original authors, problems for the replicators, problems for the editors. And it just, like, nobody is prepared for this. You're never trained on, like, I'm not saying, like, we need a training of how to, like, respond to a comment or whatever. Maybe we do. I don't know. But I think it's so rare that it makes the whole interaction so adversarial by construction, which is so sad. And I think, the way I personally see this as, how can we improve things is you need to mass reproduce and replicate things. You need to change the norm and make like writing a comment so like banal, so like, oh yeah, of course, another one. Like every day there's like 5, 6, 10 comments being released, and it just becomes normal. It becomes the norm. But I think if we look at many of the comments that you have and that you talk about in the article, but also in follow-up papers and so on, like for these authors, it was really like probably a different experience than it is right now. Like now I'm sending emails to original authors every day, multiple emails. So at one point they're getting used and they know that at one point they will receive an email from me. Let's put it this way. But for some of these authors, like this is a big shock. Like what's your reaction to this? And do you think like this is a big explanation for why we're stuck in this equilibrium where there's no comments basically? Like your graph to me shows the most important journal in economics basically nowadays does not publish comments. Basically. Yeah. And it could be supply, could be demand, could be plenty of things. But to me, we're just in an equilibrium where you would never be encouraged to write a comment. And when you do, in advance it might end up being adversarial. You know it. You must know it, I think.
I think one problem is that we only hear about very damning comments. You know what I mean? We only hear about our colleagues talking about a comment when that comment is calling out a paper to be disastrous. We never talk about when a comment just says, "Oh, this paper is perfectly fine." You know what I mean?
Wait, it never happens. To find a comment that is not released over the past 2 years that is positive, send it to me. I would want to read that.
Well, I think comment is not the right word. I think like a replication report. Like we only hear about a replication report when it's very, very bad. You know what I mean?
Wait, there's no positive replication report or reproduction report being done in like political science, economics, sociology, demography, public health, almost like if you exclude what's happening over the past few years.
Oh,
it's
yeah,
so
rare.
It's never happening. And I think that's why I'm saying it almost every time I talk about the Institute, we're in a really bad equilibrium where there's virtually no comments. And when there's a comment, it's negative. Like, I want to see the positive comments. Like, release them. Like, if you have something positive to say, like one thing at one point, I was a grad student and I got an email from a prof, really famous prof, and Colin Kammer. And I remember like, it was like, I really like your paper. I would like to see, you talk about appendix figure 16, but I cannot find it in the PDF that I have. Can you send it to me? And it just like, it blew my mind that this guy would write me and like compliment me on like my paper. And once in a while now, I do shoot emails to like younger, like, PG students when I see a discussion paper that I like, which is like, hey, really like the paper, et cetera, and that's it. There's like no comments. You would never do that. You would never like being told that someone likes your, like, it's so rare. No? And like, people say there's a cult of like positivity in like academia. I would say there's no such thing. There's no cult of negativity as well. There's just nothing. You're just by yourself. You have no idea if people like your work or not. You have guesses, and maybe you're getting citations. And let's talk about citations of comments in a second. But to me, it's like, I don't know. Referee's always anonymous anyway. I don't really know what people think of my work. Probably negative. Like, that's always like my way of thinking, because I don't know, maybe I'm skeptical or whatever. Show me positive comments. I haven't seen that, like, in the past. It's just not happening. And so to me, when people say, well, people always talk about the negative ones. Well, yeah, those are the only ones. They're rare, but there's nothing else to look at. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I do. But for example, when we go into the games, I would say like a fair amount of the replication reports that we get are very positive. The thing is that since they're very positive, they get sent to the original authors, and the only thing they can say is, "Oh, thank you. You like my work? Thank you." And no one else is gonna be talking about those ever again, just because they don't start a conversation.
I so disagree.
Really?
And you see it on social media, which I hate, by the way. But anyway, please follow us on social media. If a replicator says thank you or is grateful or whatever on social media, often it just balloons, just like explodes. And people are so happy to see something positive. And seeing that, like, hey, this is a positive report. The original author is grateful. Thank you for the feedback, pointing out a few things. In general, it's positive. People are so happy. We've released a lot of these, and it's just seen by like 50,000 views or whatever. Like, and there's lots of likes and all this complete nonsense. I really hate social media. But anyway, I think people like crave for that stuff. They crave for the other things too. Don't understand me wrong. They want to see the negative and adversarial stuff. They do. I'm not naive here. But I think people also crave for the positive. Really, I think they do. I think it's so rare to see a positive reproduction and replication. It's so rare that, and as an author, imagine receiving this. You've worked on a paper for years. It's published in a really good outlet. And then other people look at your codes and your data, and you receive a report of like 20 pages. Your first reaction when you receive my email, I'm guessing, is you're freaking out. The second thing that you do is just open the PDF as fast as possible and you read the abstract. Like, I've been told by original authors like that, like, this is anecdotal.
Your heart drops. Like, I've heard all these stories about people's papers hinging on like something miscoded or something. The first thing that comes to your mind when you receive your email must be, oh my God, how did I mess up? And how bad is it?
But I think, a lot of people are actually super happy when they read this.
Yeah, for sure.
Because you would never receive email like this. But yeah, it jumps in.
But perhaps the important important takeaway from these last 2 or 3 arguments here is that there is not much or no discussion at all, perhaps, about published work. And this is what is worrying in my sense. And also coming back to our very first question, how about, the self-correction mechanisms in economics? I think self-correction, however you define it, deliberation requires discussion about published work. And this, I think, is, and I fully agree with you, is really lacking in economics. It's basically the appreciation you get for published work is determined by the ranking of the journal in which you publish, right? And that's it, period. Right. So that's a bit where we are. And I think replicate or reproductions as we are doing it through I4R. Also only one element of a discussion, right? There can be other discussions, for example, about that kind of construct validity, I would call it, issue that you brought up earlier by the paper that you are reviewing for one of the top journals. So there are other reasons to engage with published work and criticize it, or also emphasize important positive contributions. And I think that's not happening. I think that's perhaps the important point here to make. And it is also why we engaged in that paper that we're discussing.
Yeah, for sure. And I want to talk about one of your results. And, there's quite a bit of work on this. And at one point, like, I had to review multiple papers at the same time for a special issue that we're dealing with this. And it's the stylized fact, I guess at this point, that comments are not really cited a lot. But I think more importantly, the original author's article that is being replicated, and there's a comment published. Let's say a negative comment. You have, like, there might be positive comment, but let's say, you only focus on negative comments. There's more and more evidence that this has no impact on the number of citations that the original article receives. And I think this is also what you find here.
Yes, totally. So by the way, we do have perhaps not positive comments, but we have comments that even we, as we read all of them and we rated them, whether they are substantive or not, and whether they change the original paper's contribution or its assessment, right? The assessment of the contribution. And even we rated some of them as, not really, right? They're not really changing the original paper's contribution, even if you take the comment at face value, right? So some of them are not positive perhaps, but they are also not, so they would not require changing any citation pattern.
Yeah.
So, but let's exclude them and only focus on those that we, or also the authors themselves. So some of them, even the original authors, argue that the comment has indeed changed the contribution considerably, and even these comments are not cited, and that's interesting and indeed concerning, I guess. And we are only talking about those comments or replications now, generally speaking, that made it into the AER, right?
Yeah.
I guess we all agree that there are probably many other replications out there which have been rejected by the AER or published elsewhere. And if these are not cited, okay, fair enough, but these here are in the AER. And that also leads me to a response to one of your earlier questions, Abel, where I couldn't respond immediately. Do they care, the editors? Of course, I'm not addressing individual persons here, right? When I say they don't care, it's not about one single person who doesn't care. It's about, it's more a systemic kind of statement, right?
Yeah, and this is since like the 1980s. So we're talking about a lot.
Right. So there's one interesting thing that we also highlight in the paper is that the AR considers a comment and also accepts it for publication eventually, but then there is no reference or link on the website of the replicated original paper, right, that guides the visitor to the comment.
I think this has changed. I think now.
Exactly. So now, so we exchanged with the current editor, and then he told us that they will change it from now on for future comments. But nevertheless, the AR has been publishing comments for whatever 20, 30 years now, and it's there you go. So they change it retrospectively even. That's the impact of our paper.
So this is so what I'm showing here for people watching is a paper that I've published in the American Economic Review, the journal we're talking about. So this was published in 2020. And a comment was submitted and published about the paper, and we wrote a response. So if you go on the webpage of the American Economic Review, you actually see the original author, the original study. And when you see it before you can actually download, just above where you can download the PDF, you do see the comment and the reply. So I personally think that, in part you're responsible for this. I think the data editor, Lars Vilhouver, also pushed a lot for this. And this is amazing.
That's great. So
we're saying this is amazing. And this should be normal. Maybe this should be at all the journals and it should be obvious. But given the state of affairs right now in many disciplines, I would say this is amazing.
But
Yeah.
I think my question is, do you think this is going to change the citation trajectory of a paper? Because one of the main results of your paper, on one of my main concerns, is not only that the comments don't get cited themselves, but that they don't affect the citation patterns for the original paper. And that's perhaps even more worrying, because it's like we as a discipline know that there's something going on with that original paper, and we have already addressed that. But even in those scenarios where we know that there's something wrong, we already addressed that. We as a profession keep citing those original papers as if nothing happened.
Allegedly wrong with these papers.
So there's something that required or incentivized someone to comment on it, right? I'm not
Sure.
saying that it's the main result that change, or if it's there's something, right? Do you think this is enough to nudge the discipline towards perhaps taking a second look? I'm not saying not citing, because perhaps they are still worth citing, right? But perhaps taking a second look at those original sites.
I don't think so. It won't be enough, for sure not. And you are perfectly right here. So there are various reasons for why people cite other people's work, right? And it's also, so we also would not expect the citations to go down to zero immediately, as you're saying, right? The original paper might be cited for other reasons. There might be other interesting stuff in there. And even if it's partly wrong or problematic, let's say, even that might be worth citing. So clearly there are various reasons for why we cite and why citations stay on a certain level for original papers. But I think we don't see anything, and we don't see anything, A, and B, the comment is not cited. So even for papers that are heavily cited, the comment is almost cited, not like hardly cited at all, right? And that's I think the combination of these kind of stylized facts is perhaps worrisome, and also, of course, you're also pointing at a deeper point here about like how we build, like how does knowledge build on the next the previously generated knowledge. I think that there is something here to think about in economics, and the way how we treat papers that are published in very prestigious journals. I would say they have almost paradigmatic status, and that's, I think, not what should be the case in science, right? Especially if there are good arguments to reconsider that, whatever the evidence in that paper. So I think there's a lot here to think about, which gives us reasons to be concerned. But you're right, for sure, this nudge on the website is not the game changer. It's nice.
No.
And before it was added, I think it did signal or indicate that they do not really care, perhaps. But for sure, it's not the game changer. Yeah.
But I think, a couple of things I would add to this is there's a lot of reasons why you could argue that these original studies should still be cited. Some of them are seminal studies. Some of them were published a long time ago. So the comment is published 10, 15 years after the original study is published. So you wouldn't expect an impact. It's too late. Let's put it this way. Some people would still believe the original study. And, this is probably a discussion for another episode, but I think sometimes priors people, and maybe the original study is not valid, but it led to a lot of other papers, development of a literature where there's lots of other people that use better data, better methods that actually confirm the result. And one thing that I think, I omit to say, or maybe sometimes I should maybe push myself to say it, is I think the fact that a result does not reproduce, does not replicate, or is not robust, allegedly, does not mean that the actual idea of the paper is wrong. Like, you can have an idea, like something really simple. Like, I don't know, when you do X, Y is happening. And everybody would agree with this. Like, think of like the most simple example ever. Like, I don't know, if I punch the wall, the likelihood that my hand is going to hurt is really high. Like, you don't need to write a paper about that. You don't need to randomize, like, oh, this person punched, the other person didn't punch. Like, it's obvious. It's basic, like physics or whatever. But you could have a researcher that writes a paper on this that has many coding errors and that does such a bad job at actually analyzing the data that a comment could be written and the paper could be retracted. Now, that doesn't mean that the idea, the concept, the claim is wrong. That means sometimes that the analysis, the methodology used and so on were wrong. And I think often people like have problems, and myself included, differentiating these two things. So I think there's a lot of papers that, yeah, they might not be good. The methodology might be really bad. They might be full of coding errors. But if you ask me if I still believe the main claim, well, yes, I do. And I think this happens quite a lot. And I think that's one of the key reasons why people actually keep citing these studies. It's just, well, there's also this study that looks at the effect of this on this, and they find that. And maybe it's not, but I actually still believe the general idea or concept.
Oh, for sure. Sometimes the empirical part of the paper is just, as Jörg said, one part of it. Like, a lot of papers do a very good job at describing the problem, at walking you through the thought process or the mechanisms that might affect. And the result, the coefficient, the point estimate, at the end of the day, is just the cherry on top of everything, right? On top of the story that you've built, on top of all the mechanisms, the literature that you've. So I see the case for a paper that has a comment to be cited. Of course, I think it's just a matter of how we move forward once a comment is published. Like, how do we extract value from that comment, and we acknowledge that comment is valuable as a profession, as a discipline, right? And I, now that we're almost at time, I wanted to take the time and ask, how do you see this moving forward? Like, how do we advance? How do we change economics or any social science for that matter to be in fact self-correct? Like, how do we nudge people towards making the change?
You have 30 seconds.
Yeah. Perhaps create some sort of platform and call it an institute for replication and gather many people who are enthusiastic and about replication and ready to.
That's a terrible idea. That's never going to work. That's what I was told by all the founders and by tons of people.
No, but I mean, the serious element here is that I think kind of carving out that there are reasons to be concerned about, parts of the empirical work in the social sciences. So carving this out and making it salient, I think, to me, is the natural kind of next step to perhaps then work towards what we sometimes call a better replication culture, because that ultimately is, of course, where we want to go, right? A world in which replicating, producing and discussing each other's work is the normal thing, right? And not something, as Abel was nicely pointing out earlier, not something that makes you freeze when you get an email. It should be nice to be whatever criticized. In any case, it should be normal, I think. So that's, I think, the ultimate objective. I don't know if I will kind of experience this in my lifetime, but the next kind of
you're not that old. You're quite young. You've got plenty of beautiful decades in front of you.
Yeah, but
well put.
Yeah, perhaps we should then also do an episode, or you guys should do an episode about Thomas Kuhn and the structure of scientific revolution. So even if I'm not that old, I might be too old to see the next kind of the next culture of replication in economics. No, but honestly, it can go fast, of course. It can go fast, but in any case, I think the next step is to make these issues salient and have people discuss about them, have people take notice of them, and it should not be shoved under the rug, right? So it should be salient. I think that's perhaps how we can move towards hopefully not so far away better future.
Better equilibrium, as Abel puts it.
Exactly, that's a nicer way to say it.
Jörg, it has been an absolute pleasure having you. I'm sure we could go on for another, 2 hours. So I'm sure you're going to be back at some point. We would love to have you back.
We want you back.
Of course. But I think we're at time. And I just wanted to thank you and thank Abel, of course, for being here. And I guess we'll listen to each other in the next episode. Thank you for being here.
Bye. Cheers.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.